with a huge black number 1 with a checkered effect, which the author focuses on at the very beginning. A small cutout from the screen shows views, and next to them, a number that is equal to 1 in each section. A voice said that there was a short story that was not particularly popular, after which the screen became larger. On it, one could see a window with chapters, 1 comment, and 1 view for the novel about 3 ways to survive in a destroyed world. The person thought that all the people of the country, and this was a masterpiece. This novel had a total number of chapters of 3,149, an average number of views 1.9, and an average number of comments 1.08. A young guy was sitting on a train between 2 other people and staring at his phone with a tired look, holding it straight in front of him with both hands. He thought that although yes, few people will cope with 3,000 chapters, and the novel had been published for more than 10 years, today finally the last chapter. After which, he clicked on the field where it was written that chapter 3149 had not been read, and it lit up blue. At the same moment, everything was divided into 2 halves, black and white, as if there was good and evil, before and after. The guy thought that he didn't understand, then a huge skeletal monster with glowing purple eyes rushed forward with a menacing look, as dust and small pieces of rocks rose up around them. Several more huge monsters, one in the form of a dragon and others resembling large bears with horns on their heads, screamed loudly, opening their mouths wide, and killed the people standing below them, beheading them. Immediately after that, a huge snake monster and several mending bear monsters stood in their places right in front of a guy in a white cloak who stood with a confident look next to the headless people and held a long blade in his hand. Moving his hand back a little, the same guy sitting on the train thought that the day he would see the end of the novel he had been reading for 10 years. At that moment, the train, rushing at great speed through the subway tunnel, suddenly derailed, and everything around was lit up with bright sparks emanating from the railway tracks. Suddenly, the outline of someone's head with white hair and slightly rounded goat horns of a yellowish color appeared, illuminated by light. The young guy, jumping up from his seat, put his hand straight in front of him and looked forward with an incomprehensible look, and the girl holding his other hand stood next to him, looking forward with fear on her face. While everyone around was very frightened, he gritted his teeth with displeasure, looked forward with a menacing gaze, and thought that this could not be. An image of a phone with a novel open on it immediately appeared in his head, and at that very moment, he realized that he knew this plot development. The guy stood next to the girl who was holding his hand, and they, like other passengers on the train, looked straight ahead with surprise and fear at a demon with white hair and yellowish small horns that appeared as if out of nowhere. After everything he saw, he immediately thought that the world of the novel would become a reality. A guy in a bulletproof vest with military equipment stood on the roof of a high-rise next to a girl in a cap and looked straight ahead while a little dust and bright lightning energy of golden color hovered around. Several comets flew from the sky directly towards the huge city visible from their places. The 2 blades of the swords collided with each other with a loud sound, and at the same moment, a bright spark flashed between them. The 2 guys stood in the middle of the earth, destroying everything around them and raising a huge amount of earth with fragments of stones into the air, continuing to cross their swords and emitting white and yellow energy. The guy in the black cloak delivered his next strong blow to the knee of his opponent, who parried it with his sword, and a loud sound and a bright light of sparks were heard around the area again. The guy looked forward with a very menacing look while several of his hairs flashed right in front of his eyes, and in front, there was a bright light while everything around was in sparks. The guy in the black cloak was very angry and did not understand what was happening, asking who he even was, and continued to cross his sword with the enemy who was right in front of him with a blank face. Parrying another blow, his opponent looked straight ahead with a look of complete incomprehension and calmness while a huge amount of sparks hovered around, and his face was illuminated by a bright light. After which, with a deft movement of his blade, he threw the enemy back and pulled the sword behind his back while everything around continued to collapse, and bright light along with arc surrounded everything. The guy in the bulletproof vest, with a serious and calm look, looked straight ahead, putting his hand a little forward, and holding his blade with both hands, pulled it back a little. He was in the middle of a huge amount of dust and fragments of stones raised into the air. Then he grinned mischievously as sweat poured down his face, and a huge amount of sparks and dust flew around. He said, while panning his finger, that he pressed on chapter 3149, which had not yet been read, and it lit up with blue light. Sighing heavily, he said that when he didn't want to read the chapter, he became so nervous. After which, he brought his phone, holding it with both hands, closer to his face and happily looked straight ahead. Then, Having calmed down a little, he continued to stare at his phone and got a little upset. He then began to press on the screen of his smartphone with 2 fingers on the head of 3149, which lit up with blue light. When the guy suddenly realized in his head that he would be the only reader who would know about the end of this world, the sky was already dark. Only a few large gray clouds could be seen, while small particles of dust or a few soap bubbles were flying around. Several young people in completely different clothes stood, as if on the water, right in front of the sun, which had gone beyond the horizon, leaving behind a bright yellow glow. A short story about 3 ways to survive in a destroyed world was opened on the phone screen, where it was said that there are several ways, but the author has already forgotten them. But the one who reads this will definitely survive, and this is the end. At the same moment, a notification popped up on the smartphone that the guy was holding with his hand. It said that this was the last chapter, and he did not understand what was happening. Immediately after this, he began furiously scrolling through this page on his smartphone, trying to scroll either up or down, but he couldn't. He said that this was seriously the end. In the end, he just calmed down, stopping his finger. The guy continued to sit on the train between 2 other people, with a bag lying on his legs, and held his black smartphone straight in front of him with both hands. He looked straight ahead with a surprised, incomprehensible look, continuing to hold his smartphone with one hand and kept the other near it. The train rushed along the rails at great speed, cutting through the wind, and its silhouette was not clearly visible, while the guy thought he was Dea. After which, he continued to think that this is how he introduces himself, but most people misunderstand. He stood right in front of another man who was holding a notebook in his hands and said that he was the only child in the family. He responded by saying that yes, but that's not what he meant. Then he said what he meant by these words. The man held a business card with an employee's signature and phone number in his hands and said that his name was Diakia Kim Diakia. He thought that his father gave him this name so that he could live as a strong person even when left alone. After which, Doc awkwardly scratched the back of his head, thinking that because of his father's logic, he lived an ordinary bachelor's life. The businessman with glasses, standing right in front of him, holding a business card with one hand, said that he understood everything. Doc stood in his place with a face that did not express any emotions and thought that here he was. In short, he said that he was Kim Dea, 28 years old. He graduated from a third-rate Royal University and was currently working under a contract in a branch of a large company. Doc continued to sit on the train between several strangers, slightly bent over, holding his phone in front of him with both hands. I think his hobby is reading web novels on the way home. He continued to sit in his seat with great surprise, looking into his smartphone, and did not understand what was happening. I think that, nevertheless, today's trip was different from the usual one. Doc looked straight ahead with a look full of incomprehension when suddenly he was distracted by a voice that said that at this rate, he would be sucked straight into the phone. At the same moment, he sharply raised his head up and, continuing to hold the smartphone in his hand with a blank look, he saw a girl with red hair standing right in front of him. She stood right in front of him, smiling widely, raising her hand to her ear with a general look, and looking straight at him, while he continued to sit in his seat and thought that it was you, saying, from the HR department. After which, he was very surprised and did not understand what he needed to say now because he greeted her, continuing to hold the phone in his hands. She stood right in front of him and asked if he was going home. He immediately answered that yes and asked about her, smiling. With a smile on her face, she sat down next to him on the train, holding her bag with one hand, looking at him, and said that he was lucky. The relationship manager went on a business trip today, and Doc, continuing to hold his phone with both hands, moved away a little inside and was very surprised by what was happening. She sat down next to him, her hair a little disheveled, while a flowery smell seemed to emanate from her. Doc, still sitting in his place, looked forward with a surprised, embarrassed face. Just think, only on the subway, he met the most popular girl in their company, and noticed that she smelled nice. She turned her head slightly away from her into her neck, held her hand to her face, and looked straight ahead with a calm gaze while he asked about her subway rides and thought that there were probably a lot of men from the company starting with the deputy director of HR, Kanga, and finance manager, Hannah, who offered to take her home every day. Immediately after hearing this, she lowered her head, putting her hands on the bag lying on her legs, and with a dissatisfied sigh, said that someone had stolen her bicycle. He, turning in her direction with a slightly frightened look, said that she was coming to work on her bike, and she proceeded to say that yes, she had a lot of overtime these days and didn't get enough training. She still had a few tedious things to do and thought it was a good idea. She turned to the side, smiling widely, as if illuminating everything around her, and Doc continued to sit in his place, turning his head a little to the side, smiling a little with embarrassment, and holding the phone in his hands. I think that seeing her so close, he begins to understand the feelings of men whose hearts have been stolen. In any case, it is none of his business, and she lives in a different genre of life. After which, he began to reason in his head that to understand the big picture, it was worth saying that the reason why today was different from usual was not only because of her. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by words in an incomprehensible language, and San, who was sitting next to him, was holding a white phone with both hands. With her mouth wide open in surprise, she said that it was Spanish, meaning that he could lend her money. Doc, who was sitting next to her, continued to hold the smartphone in her hands, turned his head a little to the side in surprise. He thought she was studying even on the way home. They really lived in different worlds. Closing his eyes, he continued to hold his smartphone directly in front of him. Opening his mouth wide, he said she was so diligent. At that moment, S sharply moved towards him, tilted her body, and curiously remarked that, by the way, he too reads so intently. She continued to sit next to him, leaning in his direction, looking directly at him with surprised eyes, awaiting an answer. Doc, leaning slightly to the side, raised his phone a little higher and continued to smile broadly. The screen of his smartphone displayed chapter 1 of a novel about a world after a catastrophic fall. She noticed and said it was a novel. He responded, saying he might be learning Korean. S continued to look at him with interest, her mouth wide open, beaming as she said she also liked to read novels. She mentioned having read works by Haruki Murakami and Raymond Carver, and asked about his favorite author. Doc, in fear, turned away from her, holding his phone directly in front of him. He thought, of course, she had read them. He laughed, thinking she wouldn't recognize him even if he called her by name. He then realized he would never tell her that he was reading The World After the Fall by Shinshin. Doc continued to look straight ahead with a scared look, processing what had just happened. It was true, his hobby was reading web novels on the way home from work. Several titles were visible on his smartphone screen. He pointed to one with his finger, still a little ashamed to tell anyone about it. He continued to think about why tonight felt different from usual. He began talking about his hobby, noting that the short story he had been reading for more than 10 years, about 3 ways to survive in a destroyed world, was ending today. In his mind, he imagined the page of his favorite novel with only 1 comment and 1 view. He reasoned that people might not understand how important it was to finish this novel, but it meant a lot to him. He had been reading it since middle school. At that moment, Doc started remembering his past, sitting in his room, his phone in his hands, his backpack next to him, covered in dirty clothes. He continued to reflect that even when he was bullied at school, he kept reading. He recalled sitting on a bench with his phone, surrounded by many young people. He also remembered failing his entrance exams and attending a third-rate rural university. Doc recalled sitting at the computer, uniform on, staring ahead, thinking about the wrong number he had gotten. He remembered being sent to the front lines. He continued to sit there, holding the phone in front of him, looking ahead with a serious expression. Thinking back to when he was hired by a branch of a large company, Doc felt it was better to forget this conversation since it brought no good memories. As he continued to reflect, he realized that despite all the memories, the devastation he felt at the end of the story was now replaced with the satisfaction of seeing it completed. The epilogue of Ways to Survive would be released today. Doc remained in his seat on the train, detached from everything around him, holding the phone directly in front of him with both hands. He thought about the fantasy novels he had been reading for over 10 years. Some had 3,149 chapters. He reasoned that it must have taken the author over 10 years to write more than 3,000 chapters for a novel with an average of only 1 reader per chapter. As Doc sat there, it felt as though all the pages from his smartphone were laid out before him, showing the chapters and views. He thought about the 120 views per chapter, wondering if the story was specifically dedicated to him. Then, a comment page appeared on his phone, where he had expressed his gratitude to the author, saying he couldn't wait for the epilogue. Even though he wanted to donate to the author, he realized that as someone with a low salary, he couldn't afford it. So, he wrote heartfelt comments instead. Doc continued to sit on the train, holding his smartphone. He thought about how he had tried to get the novel onto the recommendation board, but it was hated despite being a good story if you were patient enough to keep reading. People just didn't understand. At that moment, Sam, who had been sitting next to him, returned to his side. She looked at him in surprise as he turned his head to face her. With confusion, he awkwardly began to say that, if you think about it, it has already been a year since they started working in this company, and time flies by. He thought that he had forgotten what they were talking about and, at an awkward moment, decided to change the subject. She immediately began to smile. S sat right in front of him and smiled widely, laughing a little with her eyes closed, saying that they didn't know anything exactly at that time. Doc sat opposite her, also laughing a little with his eyes closed, his mouth wide open, saying that it was true. He remembers everything as clearly as yesterday, but the contract period is almost over. At that moment, S's expression suddenly changed, becoming one of surprise and fear. Then Doc continued to reason that he had forgotten that Yu Sang-oh grade was recognized. She had already been promoted to full-time. Doc continued to sit in his place, awkwardly scratching the back of his head or laughing, saying that he completely forgot to congratulate her and probably should have learned other languages more diligently. She put her hand to her chest awkwardly and said that this was not at all the case. There is also a review of effectiveness as she continued to sit in her seat, looking worried, her hands on the bag that lay on her legs, and looking straight ahead. While Doc reasoned that he didn't want to admit it, she amazed him. If this world were a novel, the protagonist would be someone like her. It's obvious she doesn't even try, while she works hard, reads web novels, and studies. After which, he continued to reason that this was why it was obvious that she would become a full-time employee and his contract would be terminated suddenly. With her mouth slightly open while sweat was running down her cheek, she turned to document. He looked down a little with a surprised look and asked her to continue talking. She immediately said that if he didn't mind, she could show him the application that she uses. At the same moment, Doc raised his gaze and stared forward with eyes full of incomprehension and surprise, reasoning that if his life were in a different genre, the cricket remained in place, holding it with its small paws. While Doc continued to discuss what he meant, if the genre of his life were not realism, opposite him sat a boy with a net and a plastic container with a green lid in which there were several crickets. He continued to argue that, for example, it could be fantasy. Doc continued to sit in his place, placing both hands on his back as if detached from everything that was happening around him and directed his surprised gaze forward, reasoning what he could become. After which, combining all the past thoughts that arose in his head, he reasoned that he was the protagonist at that moment. The holding devices in the train began to shake sharply from the sudden turn and S distracted him. Doc continued to sit in his seat with a very serious look and looked forward, telling her that everything was fine. She looked in his direction with surprised eyes, her mouth slightly open, while he continued to reason that he did not know. Then he continued to reason that, however, it was clear. He sat with his serious gaze directed forward, grinning a little, and said that even if she showed him the applications, it would not change anything. After which, Doc continued to argue after everything that had been said by him, that because the genre of his life was definitely realism, he sat in the same place next to his girlfriend and continued to argue that, in this genre, he was clearly not a protagonist, but a reader. Slightly bowing his head forward, he said that the reader lives the life of a reader. S was very surprised by what she heard and fixed her uncomprehending gaze straight ahead. At the same moment, with her feet together, she said that the life of the reader, after which she added that he really did say interesting things. Doc turned in her direction awkwardly, his mouth slightly open, looked forward with incomprehension. S then sat next to him, clenching her hands into fists in front of her, looked forward with a confident look, her mouth slightly open, and said that it seemed like she was living an ivory life. Doc, who was sitting next to her, looked in her direction with a grin and was very surprised by what had just been said and did not understand what was happening. She sat in her seat in the same position, slightly tilting her head forward and looked down, saying that this is how she should do everything, and will imitate Doc and will be devoted to her life. Disappointed by the sight of him turning away from her, looking ahead with tired eyes, thinking that at least it had become quieter, he continued to hold the phone in his hand, which vibrated sharply and he felt it. Doc continued to sit in his seat, leaning forward a little. With both hands, he held his smartphone with the screen on and thought that this was a message. He reasoned that, then, he would never have guessed. At the same moment, he opened a chat with TLS 1223, who expressed his great gratitude to him. Doc sat in his place with a look of complete surprise and continued to hold his phone with his hands, directing his gaze forward, abruptly changing his facial expression to a lack of understanding of the current situation. He thought this was the author of the methods of survival and reasoned about what he would encounter immediately after this. Doc messaged him, asking if he was the author. After that, he was very surprised because TLS 1223 immediately answered him and wrote a message saying that he was able to finish the short story to the end thanks to him and even won the competition. Doc continued to sit in his seat, holding the phone with one hand and covering his mouth with the other in surprise, while sweat flowed down his cheek. He thought that his favorite novel had won the competition and this was actually written by the author. Immediately after this, Doc wrote a message with his congratulations and asked what competition he was talking about. TLS 123 at that moment answered him that he would not understand by the name, and this was a little-known competition. The novel would also be monetized. Then, the author, after pausing for a while, wrote the following message, monetization will begin when the epilogue is downloaded, and I would like to send you a gift as a thank you. Please write me your email. At that moment, a head with short white hair appeared as if out of nowhere, from which small rounded horns of yellow color, reminiscent of a goat, grew. He reasoned about what the world would soon face. Doc immediately wanted to clarify about the gift and wrote a message about this. TLS-123 immediately replied to him that thanks to him, this story was able to take shape and appear in this world. He just silently continued to look at this message. Immediately after that, Doc raised his phone a little higher and stared forward in surprise and confusion, thinking that his favorite novel had won the competition. He said that it was a little-known competition and maybe the author lied because he felt ashamed. S continued to sit next to him while Doc continued to stare at his phone, which he held with his trembling hand. He thought that maybe he could get a gift card worth $50,000. That would be nice. At that moment, one message was received by email. An email message from TLS-123 opened on the smartphone screen, saying that monetization would begin at 7 p.m. and this would help him. Doc, looking at all this, thought that the gift had finally arrived to him and that today at 7 p.m. it would happen. It was already 6:55, and he still had 5 minutes. After which, with a thoughtful face, holding the smartphone in his hand and the other hand leaning against his chin, he looked directly at the screen and thought that he should look in his favorites. On the screen of his smartphone, he saw a notification that the novel he was looking for was not found. He thought that it was strange, and it had never happened that they removed novels for monetization without notifying readers. Doc, who was sitting next to Sam, continued to look at his phone, and she herself did so, when at the same moment, the lights in the entire electric train suddenly turned off, and a strange sound was heard. Sam raised her head, looking up from her phone, and with confusion in her eyes, did not understand what was happening. Doc followed her example. At the same moment, the train derailed, and everything around was illuminated by a huge number of sparks emanating from the railway track. Sam, covering her face with her hands and lowering her head, screamed in fear and did not understand what was happening. The train was taking a turn, continuing to derail, and everything around was filled with bright sparks. Someone shouted that these were terrorists inside the train. Several passengers were very frightened by what was happening, and with their mouths wide open, they screamed loudly, trying to grab onto something so as not to fall. At this moment, the strange monster smiled, exposing its white fangs, and sighed heavily. At that moment, the train stopped in place, and a huge amount of sparks and smoke emanated from it in different directions. All the passengers on the train were very frightened and scattered, not understanding what had just happened. Doc, who was sitting in his seat, fixed his gaze on the phone and asked if Yusang was okay. She said yes and did not understand what just happened. He kept telling her that she shouldn't worry and that it was probably nothing serious. At that moment, on the screen of his smartphone, the time suddenly switched from 6:59 to 7 o'clock, and he looked straight ahead. With a surprised look, he thought about 7 p.m. and monetization, reasoning that by luck, he caught the moment when the time changed. However, this moment did exist. Everyone on the train suddenly raised their heads when a loud announcement was made into the microphone, telling all passengers to run. Sam sat in her place, her mouth wide open in surprise and fear, and turned to document. He, continuing to sit in the same spot, turned his head to the side with an expression full of fear and confusion. He was very surprised. He continued to look to the side, suddenly noticing something as his face was illuminated by a bright light. As if out of nowhere, a bright red light appeared in the middle of the carriage, emitting energy like lightning, and everyone covered their faces. The red light continued to sparkle ahead. Doc raised his head slightly, covering it with his hand, his face filled with surprise and complete incomprehension as he looked straight ahead. All the passengers on the train were very surprised and frightened, as were Doc and Sam, who stood in the middle of the car with incomprehension on their faces. A voice then announced that the residential service of Planetary System 8612 had been terminated and the main scenario would now begin. Doc immediately, after all the madness that happened to him, thought that at that moment, his life changed its genre. After that, Doc thought that at the moment of his appearance, someone exclaimed that it was Takabe. Doc and his girlfriend stood in the middle of the train and looked up, along with the rest of the passengers, and did not understand what was happening. Doc looked up with a blank look and a little frightened, reasoning that he did not understand why this particular phrase came to his mind. The train stood in place in the middle of the subway tunnel, while small sparks and a huge amount of smoke continued to emanate from it. Doc continued to reason that the subway train had suddenly stopped. The car was in pitch darkness. The passengers on the train were very scared and surprised by what was happening, and Doc and Sam stood in the middle of the car, equally scared, looking up. Doc thought that this couldn't be happening. The subway often slows down on the tracks, and this is not surprising. He continued reasoning that familiar scenes from the first chapters of the novel kept popping up in his head. After that, he reasoned that this was impossible. This simply could not happen. Sam, with her mouth slightly open while sweat flowed down her cheek, spoke about Takabe. Everyone on the train was very frightened, and Doc turned in her direction, asking her again with a surprised look, while she stood holding his hand with both hands and didn't understand what was happening. At the same moment, Doc turned around sharply, his eyes widening. He remembered that this absolutely could not happen. It was impossible. An image of a phone with text from a novel appeared in his head, which talked about a furry creature with 2 small horns, which was called Takabe. He said it out loud again. Suddenly, near the door between the cars, a bright red oval-shaped glow appeared from above, and everyone in the car looked there in surprise. Doc continued to remember lines from his favorite novel about a galvanized, strange, and furry monster. Doc continued to stand in the same place, staring forward with a surprised look next to his companion. He was very amazed at what was happening and said that this was something strange. He thought about the impossibility of what was happening, continuing to remember the words from his favorite novel from chapter 1. At the place where the bright red glow came from, a small monster with white fur appeared, smiling broadly, its legs spread to the sides with small yellow horns. The plot says that this is why it was called Takabe. Below, Doc fixed his surprised gaze with wide-open eyes straight ahead, not understanding the current situation. He, his girlfriend, and all the other passengers in the carriage stood in their seats with surprised looks while a small furry monster with horns levitated above them. After everything that happened, Doc continued to think that the moment when fantasy and reality merged together was now. Takabe continued to stay in the air, above the others, and putting his paw to his mouth, he coughed. After which, opening his mouth wide, he began to speak in a language incomprehensible to everyone. All the passengers on the train didn't understand what he was saying. Some said that this was augmented reality, while others said that he was very vile. At that moment, Doc continued to argue that no one except him, understands the importance and seriousness of this situation. Doc continued to stand in his place, staring blankly straight ahead as sweat rolled down his cheek and thought that this was definitely a Takabe. He then reasoned that in the world of survival techniques, it was the Takabe that began the incessant appearance. At the same moment, with a trembling hand, he squeezed his phone with great force, his fingers trembling. He thought that this was impossible and could not be happening, continuing to reason that there were troubles and disasters. At that moment, Doc was distracted, looking away at Sam, standing next to him. She had an incomprehensible and frightened look and said that it was a little like Spanish and that she could try to talk to him. Many other passengers on the train were standing right in front of him, looking in her direction with obvious dissatisfaction. His mouth wide open, he said that she didn't even know what it was and couldn't ask him to lend her some money, as she had recently taught. She said it was not her intention. At that moment, the conversation was interrupted by Takabe, who shouted that they should hear him. He said that dealing with this was a hassle and that the Korean patch did not work correctly. After which, he raised his paws to his mouth, opening it wide, and shouted that the people should hear him clearly. Suddenly, someone interrupted his voice, asking what he was doing now. Takabe was very surprised by what happened and looked down, where a young guy stood with a displeased face, folded his arms over his chest, and said that he was probably making a film but had to come for an interview, so he should let him go quickly. The guy continued to stand in his place with a dissatisfied look. Takabe, clapping his hands, smiled a little and said that he understood about the interview, not knowing they were taking place at such a time. After laughing a little, he continued to say that it looked like they didn't do enough research on this. He was told that most people would agree if they started monetizing at 7 p.m. and that he didn't know what he was talking about. After which, Takabe, still levitating in the air above the others, said that everyone should calm down, take a seat, and listen. He had very important information to share with them. A man standing below, with a dissatisfied look on his face, said that there was no difference and they needed to start the train. The rest of the people also began to say that they didn't agree to work with him and that he should stop, or he would have to compensate them for this. Meanwhile, the little girl, pointing upward with her finger, told her mother with a surprised face that this was a cartoon, and Doc, at this point, reasoned that there was no doubt. Most of the passengers in the carriage were very indignant and, with their mouths wide open, shouted their displeasure. Doc continued to discuss the development of events that he knew. Immediately after that, he realized that he had to stop them. Doc took his companion by the shoulder, and she was very surprised by this. He seriously thought about how he could do this and turned to Sam, telling her not to move. At that moment, Takabe, who was in the air above all the passengers in the carriage, laughed and said that they were all very noisy. He told them to be quiet, after which he seemed to turn into an evil monster with red eyes, demanding blood. He tensed his whole body and told them to shut up. Instantly after this, he tore off the head of the disgruntled guy standing below. He didn't even have time to understand what happened. The legs of the other passengers standing next to him and the floor of the carriage were covered in blood, and everyone screamed in fear. The girl, along with the man standing next to this guy, was very frightened and surprised by what was happening, looking straight ahead where, instead of the guy's body, there was just a huge puddle of blood. All the passengers in the carriage stood frozen in place, while everything in the area was under the influence of the monster. Takabe smiled widely, showing his white teeth, and said, with obvious anger in his voice, that this was not a movie shoot. Immediately after this, he tore off the head of another passenger, while the others screamed in horror, saying that this was not a dream. Takabe tore open the heads of several more passengers in the carriage, spreading blood everywhere, while the others screamed in horror and tried to run away from him. Doc and Sam stood frozen in their places, very scared of what was happening, and watched as Takabe continued to say that this was not the reality they lived in and that they needed to understand it. At that moment, Doc fixed his menacing gaze forward, gritting his teeth as sweat ran down his cheek. He reasoned that he was right, and this was all real. The part of him that didn't believe in this situation was fading. The floor of the car was covered in a huge amount of blood, which spread like a puddle and splashed to the sides. Doc continued to reason, falling silent as the car became a bloodbath. The passengers were in their seats, looking frightened and unable to move, while Takabe continued to speak. He said that their life had been pleasant and calm until that moment. Then, raising his paws up, opening his mouth wide, he illuminated everything around with a white glow and, in a loud voice, proclaimed that they were born, breathed, ate, and multiplied when they wanted without paying bills. They truly lived in a beautiful world. At the same moment, he raised his head, smiled widely, showing his teeth, and looked forward with black eyes and sparkling white pupils. He added that those good days were in the past because nothing is free in this world. The surviving passengers of the carriage were greatly frightened by what had happened and continued to listen carefully to the words of this monster, remaining in their seats. One of the passengers, a man in a striped business suit, stood right in front of Takabe with a serious face but was clearly afraid. He gritted his teeth. Doc turned his serious gaze forward, full of dissatisfaction, holding his hand to his forehead, and said that the man was the manager from the finance department, promoted through personal connections. Sam, standing next to him with a face full of incomprehension, looked forward with a frightened look and agreed. The man, standing right in front of the furry monster, pulled out a small piece of paper and said that if Takabe was asking for money, he could give him as much as he wanted. He then showed his business card to display who he was and asked how much Takabe wanted. Takabe, looking straight ahead with a surprised face, said that the man was in money. With a malicious grin, Takabe looked forward with a smug expression and said that if the man let him out of there, he would give him as much money as he required. He took out the money and placed it in front of him, continuing to look ahead with a smug grin, thinking that it worked and that there was nothing money couldn't buy. The monster, however, said that money was simply plant fibers that people had mutually agreed to use. Takabe snapped his fingers, and at that moment, the money the man had taken out ignited and burned. The man looked at it with fear on his face, not understanding what was happening. Takabe added that this only worked in their space-time continuum. The man knelt down, placing his hands in front of him with a pathetic look, watching the money disappear in the remaining fire. Takabe pointed his paw forward and said that these pathetic pieces of paper had no value in the macroscopic world. He warned that if the man tried this again, his brains would be scattered in different directions. Takabe raised his paw to his forehead, flicked his other hand with obvious displeasure, and said that their debts would increase. If they continued to talk like this, it would be quicker to make them earn money and see everything with their own eyes than to explain to them stupid people 100 times. Suddenly, the horns on Takabe's head grew several times larger, and he rushed along the carriage at great speed. The passengers looked at him with frightened expressions, raising their heads up. Takabe continued to say that channel B1-7623 was open and the constellation had joined. People stood in their places, their faces filled with great surprise and fear, not understanding what was happening. Then, bluish-colored system windows appeared right in front of them. Some passengers were very surprised by the information they saw on the system windows, while others smiled broadly, rejoicing at the data they received. Doc continued to stand in his place with a surprised face when a small blue system notification window began to appear right in front of him. At the same moment, he narrowed his eyes in surprise or misunderstanding of the situation that had occurred. The system notification window displayed a message about receiving the main script, alerting him to major scenarios, with one proof of significance, where one or more life forms needed to be killed. Takabe remained in the air above all the passengers in the carriage, clasping his hands together, and said that he wished everyone good luck. He then smiled widely, illuminating everything around with his brightly glowing red eye, and said they should entertain them with an exciting show. Immediately after that, he evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only a small glow. All the passengers in the carriage were very surprised by what had happened, looking up with fear on their faces while the system notification windows hovered in front of them. Doc and Sam stood in the middle of the carriage, holding their phones. While small blue particles hovered around and the other passengers on the train were very scared, San chewed her nail with a trembling hand and, holding the phone directly to her ear, called the police. She stood right in front of Dewan with a frightened look, held her phone in one hand, and leaned the other against her chest, saying that they were not answering and did not understand what to do. Doc, standing right in front of her, extended his arms forward and told her she should calm down. Doc stood right in front of her with a face full of confidence, and with his mouth slightly open, looked at her, saying that she remembers the game that their development team created, a game where the world was destroyed and only a few people survived. She didn't understand what he was talking about, looking at him with fear on her face, her mouth slightly open, and he added that she should think about it like that. He put his hands on her shoulders and stood with a serious look, his mouth slightly open, saying that they were inside her, and she stood in her place holding her hands to her chest with fear on her face while everyone around was in turmoil. She stood in her place looking straight ahead with a surprised face full of fear and said that the game and the rules, while the blue system notification window appeared right in front of her, and Doc said that everything is simple and everyone has rules and she needs to follow them. Confident look, trying to understand the current situation, while bluish particles were flying around and a red glow was coming from in front. While San stood behind him with fear on her face, crossing her arms over her chest from her own powerlessness, Takabe continued to float in the air with his yellow horns that suddenly grew and smiled widely, while below there were many corpses of people who were bleeding. The plot says that Takabe extended his antennae, and dead bodies were lying around like garbage. Some passengers in the carriage were shaking in horror on the sidelines and did not understand what was happening, while others simply prayed with their palms together and begged for mercy. The plot says that a blood-soaked, shaking office worker, an old woman, prays without moving from her seat. Doc and his companion stood still, looking forward, watching everything that was happening while he continued to reason that he still couldn't believe it, but he could no longer doubt that several people were already standing near the door. One of them, with rage and fear on his face, was hitting it with his fists and screaming for someone to open it, and the other was saying that he needed to knock it out with a hammer. While Doc reasoned that he should just accept it, not knowing why, but one thing he can say for sure, at the same moment, an image appeared in his head from his phone with a novel about 3 ways to survive in a destroyed world. He continued to reason that the novel's ways of survival that he had been reading for 10 years became a reality and unfolded before his eyes. Doc stood in the same place, leaning his hand with the phone to his chest and with closed eyes and a serious expression on his face, thinking about what he should come up with. After which, he suddenly opened his eyes and looked forward with a serious look, thinking that he should do something to survive in this new world. At this point, the system notification was alerting about the main scenario number 1, proof of significance and the need to kill 1 or more life forms in the middle of the train car. Small blue particles and some smoke continued to float until a voice abruptly interrupted everyone and said that it was easier for everyone to remain calm. Doc and San, as well as several other passengers in the carriage, turned to the side of the voice, which continued to say that they needed to take a deep breath and stop making noise. The young man, with a rather confident look, putting one hand forward and holding a wallet in the other, with his mouth slightly open, said that they should calm down and listen to him. As they know, in the event of a national disaster, small riots can lead to large casualties, namely, therefore, he will take control of the situation. The people who were in the same carriage were very dissatisfied with what they heard and said that it was unclear who he was and that a national disaster was some kind of nonsense. But with a deft movement of his hand, he opened his wallet and showed his military ID at the ministry with the name Lee Hyun-sun, after which Hyun, standing in his place, stretched his hand forward with his ID, looked straight ahead with a confident look, and opening his mouth slightly, said that at the moment he was an army lieutenant serving in the 6502 unit. With great surprise, looking straight ahead and not understanding the current situation, the people around him said that he was a soldier and was a lieutenant. Immediately after this, Hyun, with a confident look at the other passengers on the train, extended his hand with the phone in it and showed it to everyone, saying that he had received a message from the unit earlier. A message was written on the screen of his smartphone that a level 1 national disaster had been declared, and an urgent gathering of all troops was announced. The people who saw this said that a national disaster had really begun. One of the passengers in a white shirt was very indignant and, with his arms outstretched and his mouth wide open in anger, said that the soldiers should tell him what exactly was going on, what about the Blue House, and what they were doing. He should immediately contact the president. Hyun, standing right in front of him, in one hand behind his back, and with a confident look, standing in the same place, said that he tried to contact the unit, but after which he added that he asks for forgiveness because he is an ordinary soldier. He does not have a direct line to the Blue House. While Doc stood in his place, with a face of complete incomprehension and a huge number of blue particles hovering around, he reasoned that a national disaster was not surprising given the current state of affairs. Another passenger in the carriage shouted, then who was he to control this situation? Doc looked straight ahead with a serious and puzzled look, reasoning that he was surprised for another reason and thought it was Lieutenant Lee Hyun-sung, as he continued to say that for the safety of all citizens. Hyun stood in his place with a confused look, with his hands straight in front of him, while several passengers in the carriage were in front of him. Doc continued to reason that he knew about him. This was the first time they had seen him, but this name was deeply imprinted in his mind. After which, an image of the steel sword of Lee Hyun-sung, a lieutenant in the Korean army, stood in his head with an emotionless face. Doc continued to reason that he was one of the significant supporting characters in the means of survival. After which, Doc, with a clearly dissatisfied and incomprehensible face, closed his eyes and clenched his teeth, scratching the back of his head with his phone, thinking that a character from the novel had even appeared, and his speech and behavior were completely consistent with what was written in the novel. At the same moment, he continued to scratch the back of his head with his phone and suddenly stopped, thinking that something was wrong. Doc stood in his place with a phone in his hands and looked with a serious and thoughtful look at Hyun standing in front of him, who was clearly confused, and reasoned that Hyun was not presented in this way in the novel. Doc continued to stand in his place, looking forward as if preserved from everything that was happening around him at Hyun, who stood in the same place with a confused look, with his hands out in front of him and not understanding what was happening now. And Doc thought that he was sure of this as the only reader of Ways of Survival, and one mention of him was not like that. He definitely appeared after the end of one scenario and did not understand what was happening now. Immediately after this, he turned sharply to the side, turned on his phone, and, as if searching for something in it, thought that if he could reread Ways of Survival, he would be able to find out. But at this moment, one of the train passengers, looking clearly puzzled, held out his hand with the phone in the air and shouted that the Prime Minister, making a speech, was indeed declaring the Level 1 national disaster. Doc stood in his place, slightly lowering his hand with the phone down, and looked at the phone with a puzzled look, who was holding it in her hand and looking at Doc with a puzzled look, turning to him. While a voice spoke from there, addressing all fellow citizens, on the screen of her smartphone, one could see a businessman in a suit live broadcasting a report about a first-degree disaster. He said that in an unknown number of zones of Seoul, unknown terrorists had become active and made their move. Governments were bringing all the ways and means to stop the terrorists. And Doc, at that moment, after everything he had heard, began to reason that, as he thought, he was familiar with the content of terrorism in this speech. Right, it would be easier to think about it in this way. Listen to him. In reality, you can understand how absurd it sounds. The rest of the people in the same carriage grabbed their phones and stared at them, turning on the live broadcast, and did not understand why the Prime Minister was speaking and not the President. Someone was saying that the President had probably been killed, after which they continued their reasoning with faces full of fear, saying that they weren't sure, but they wrote so in the comments, and for sure, he was an idiot. And this is an obvious line, and Doc and his companion stood to the side, observing everything that was happening, reasoning that of course, it was not a lie. Suddenly, a loud gunshot sound came straight from the phone screens, and all the passengers threw their smartphones from their hands with a scream, their faces full of fear. There was still a report on their smartphones, during which the Prime Minister, who was dead and lying on the table, was shown, and everyone said that he was dead. After which, the broadcast began to break up a bit, with white noise emanating while footage of the murder of an important person in the country was still visible. Then, Takabe appeared on the phone screens, smiling broadly and saying that he had already said everything, while the white noise continued in the background. After that, he fully appeared in the frame, opening his mouth wide, showing his large white fangs, and looked forward with his glowing red huge eyes, saying that this is not something simple like terrorism. The train passengers, with trembling hands and surprise and fear, continued to hold their smartphones, watching what was happening, as did Doc, while he said that they still did not understand anything, and this would not work. This was not like a game, according to the information that citizens in this country play games well. Doc then lowered his hand closer to the bag and squeezed the phone inside it with great force, while Takabe said that he then wanted to increase the difficulty. All the people in this carriage were very surprised by what had happened because, right in front of them, out of nowhere, a system notification window appeared with a countdown. The time started at 2400 hours 22, and suddenly, the time began to decrease, and the number 22 changed to 21. Everyone did not understand what it was. Immediately after this, The numbers on the notification window began to change rapidly, and everyone was very surprised by this. The system notified that the remaining time had been reduced, then added that the remaining time was now 10 minutes. The people who were on this train were very surprised by what was happening and looked at the small system notification window, on which the time was written as 10. At this point, the system notification window alerted that Major Scenario 1 had started, the proof of significance, where one or more life forms needed to be killed. The time condition changed from 30 minutes to 10 minutes. The people in the carriage were very frightened by what had happened, while right in front of them, the system notification window continued with the countdown, now showing 9:59. The system notification said that as an additional punishment, if one murder did not occur over the next 5 minutes, all living things in the carriage would be destroyed. All the people in the carriage were immediately very frightened and did not understand what was happening, shouting that this was some kind of nonsense, just a joke. They turned to the soldier with questions about their subsequent actions and the inaction of the police. Hyun, who stood in front of them all with a confused look, said that everyone should calm down and listen. Doc stood in his place with a face that did not express any emotion, and S stood next to him, holding his hand, trembling a little, looking forward with a blank look, while everyone around them argued about something. Doc was very frightened by what was happening, and sweat was running down his cheek while everyone around him screamed. He thought that everything was happening as he expected and continued to reason that these were definitely the same events as in the methods of survival, but the anxiety he now felt did not go away. Hyun stood in the same place, looking to the side with his hand straight in front of him, looking very confused. Doc continued to think that the minor character appeared like that. After which, an image appeared in his head of a young guy standing with his back, half in shadow, in a very long black cloak, surrounded by sparks. Doc reasoned that, for some reason, that guy was not there yet. He continued to stand in the same place next to his girlfriend, turning his head a little to the side, thinking that according to the story he knew, he should have already appeared. The man behind him was looking straight ahead with a clearly frightened look, gritting his teeth out of fear, and screamed loudly at the door of the carriage that connected them to another. A huge amount of blood suddenly appeared on the glass, while the people standing right in front of them were saying that there was a murder in that carriage and that they needed to block the doors and not let them in here. The rest were just screaming loudly. After which, one of the passengers in the carriage extended his hand to the door and said that they should block it while he seemed to be electrocuted. Bright yellow energy began to emanate from the door. He abruptly pulled back his hand, standing right in front of the door, which at the same moment sparkled with small yellow circles and lit up like a lightning strike. Doc and S turned their heads in that direction and were very surprised by what was happening, while a bright yellow light came from in front, and the others did not understand what it was. They said that something transparent appeared in front of the door. The man stood right in front of the door, which suddenly lit up with a bright yellow light. Raising his head up, he was very surprised when the notification system said that until the script was completed, access to the carriage would be limited. At that moment, one of the train passengers took the phone in his hand, turning on a live broadcast on it where Takabe was, who put his paws behind his head and crossed his legs, laughing. He said that interesting things were happening somewhere, but somewhere they just had to happen. After which, he suddenly raised his paw up and snapped his fingers, saying, "Okay, here's a little favor for everyone, and he will show what will happen to them if nothing happens in the next 5 minutes." Suddenly, a huge system notification window appeared above the passengers' heads, showing a video of school children sitting at their desks. One of the carriage passengers, with glasses on his eyes, adjusting them a lot, was very surprised. The system notification screen showed several girls sitting at desks at school, and he said that these were the uniforms of Teppan Girls High School. Immediately after this, on the live broadcast, the girls jumped up from their seats and screamed loudly in fear, running in different directions. At this point, the system notification said that time had expired. Doc and S, like the other passengers on the train, looked ahead with a surprised look full of fear, while the system notification announced that payment was beginning to be collected. Doc immediately closed his eyes in fear and squinted hard. At that moment, the system's notification screen showed a live feed of the school students dying one after another, their heads exploding, all accompanied by loud screams and requests for rescue, while blood poured all around. Several girls ran forward with a frightened look, heading toward the door, asking to open it. At that moment, one of them suddenly died, and the other, turning around, said that she could not believe it and was even more scared, screaming loudly. All the people in the carriage were very surprised and frightened, looking up at the system notification window, which was glowing in blue, and did not understand what was happening. After which, several of them turned their surprised gaze upward and were very puzzled by what was happening. The system's live notification screen showed two hands squeezing a girl's neck with tremendous force. The school student held her classmate by the throat with great force, while she grunted in pain and tried to stop her. At the same moment, she sharply began to loosen her grip and eventually completely let go of her classmate's throat, ceasing to choke her. All the people in the carriage were very surprised and frightened by what was happening until a loud crash was heard from the system notification window. The girl stood in her place, lowering her head slightly and sighed heavily while white noise emanated around her. The notification system said that the survivors of Channel Bay 23515. The girl turned her head to the side, and blood was visible on her face as she looked forward with an emotionless face. The system notification, through the white noise, continued to say that Teppan Girls High School, 2nd year Class B. After which, the system added that she was Lee Ji-hyun. On the system notification screen, the live broadcast continued, showing the girl standing in the middle of the class next to her classmate, who had been killed by her. The system once again showed her status. Immediately after this, Takabe smiled widely at the system notification screen, showing his fangs, saying that it was a lot of fun. Doc was very tense and looked forward with a very displeased look full of anger, while sweat ran down his cheek. Suddenly, several people in the carriage began to slowly move away from each other, looking at each other with faces full of fear and bewilderment, creating complete silence, not understanding the current situation. All the people in the carriage were very frightened and did not understand what was happening now, while the system notification window with a live broadcast from the high school continued to hang directly above their heads. The woman's hand touched the guy's sleeve. Doc and S looked to the side. The girl covered her mouth, shaking from what she saw. The guy turned around, squinting his eyes, and thought it was strange why that guy had not appeared yet. Doc brought the phone to his face and began to move his finger across the screen with the thought that events were happening right now that he remembered from the novel, but some of them were unknown to him. The guy looked at the screen and thought that the only way to find a way out of this situation. Doc was startled as he reread the methods of survival, but the phone said that the novel he was looking for didn't exist. He began to think that it was still not available, probably, and that no copy would be found on the internet. After all, it was completely unpopular. Doc looked down, his eyes widening as he swiped his finger across the screen in surprise, thinking, no, wait a minute. A link to an attached file appeared on his phone. He clicked on it, and thought that this couldn't happen. Doc looked down in surprise as another file appeared on the screen with 3 ways to survive in a destroyed world. He opened his eyes wide at what he saw and began to rub his eyes, not believing what he was seeing. Doc looked at the screen again in surprise. Nothing had changed on the phone, the attached file was still available. He raised the phone to his face and thought, did he really send me a copy of the novel as a gift? Isn't this piracy? Maybe not, after all, I received the original from the author. 2 messages popped up in front of his face, saying that he had received a special attribute. A unique skill slot had been activated. He thought that all the heroes and their survival methods had unique attributes and could use equally unusual skills. Doc looked carefully at the notifications and realized that this was definitely a game. The guy closed his eyes and remembered the characteristic window. It would be better to know the characteristics of the attribute and skill. Doc looked in surprise at the message that appeared. The notification said that he could not activate the characteristics window. He thought, has this ever happened before? If I don't look at the stats window, I won't be able to know what attributes and skills I have. Doc looked at his phone in fear, trying to figure out what to do next. He looked carefully at the screen and remembered that he had forgotten to first open the file. A message appeared that due to the use of its unique attribute, the reading speed had been increased. Doc, with surprised eyes, began to read the text very quickly. His legs gave way, and he took a step forward to steady himself. The guy grabbed his head and looked at the screen in surprise, wondering, what the hell is this? The effect of my attribute? It took him less than a minute to read the first act of survival methods. Doc put his hand to his forehead and realized that, thanks to this, he had found it in the text he read. He saw the carriage number 377. The guy raised his head and looked forward. The number of the carriage in which he was traveling was 3,887. Doc stood and looked toward the door, thinking that it was 377. He had found the source of his anxiety. The guy looked at the blood-stained window of the next carriage and realized that the reason why events were slightly different from what he knew was that the carriage in which he was now locked was located behind the protagonist's carriage. S turned her head to the side, and Doc stood with a thoughtful look, remembering that if this was true, what had happened to the people in carriage 387. The girl, trembling with fear, asked the guy if they shouldn't stop them. A window appeared in which the plot tells us that he looked through the blurry window into carriage 387. Doc turned his head and looked at what was happening behind him. A message popped up in which the author of the novel said that it was already too late, the passengers could not avoid the worst, and only 2 survivors remained. The hand grabbed the man by the jacket, and at that moment, a furious male voice rang out, "What the? Who said he could escape? He feels like crap right now." The guy in the green suit pulled his hand back to strike and asked if the man could shut up. The man asked to be saved and shouted that he had to go. Kim threw a punch, and blood sprayed everywhere. Doc realized that he already knew who the 2 survivors would be. The guy looked down with fury in his eyes and said, "Didn't I tell you to shut up?" Doc looked away toward the girl, who was covering her mouth with her hands in horror. He thought that S would most likely die. The guy looked at the screen, which said that only La Hyun-sun and Kim In-won survived in that carriage, and thought that only 2 survived. Besides these 2, the rest would most likely die, including him. The man grabbed the guy by the arm and shouted, "What are you doing?" A man in a formal suit and glasses held the guy by the hand and shouted, "How dare a brat like him treat his elders like that?" Doc and Sam watched what was happening with horror in their eyes. He thought it was manager Han Mei. Kim turned his head and looked questioningly at the man. The guy in the green jacket turned to the manager and asked if the old man had decided to die. It seemed he had not yet fully realized what was happening. KH told him what kind of nonsense he was talking about. The man looked confusedly at the guy, who pointed his finger to the other end of the car and said, "Can't you see?" People with horror in their eyes looked at the screen, from which screams could be heard. "Save him. Let him finally die." The tension in the air intensified as Kim continued to say that he still didn't understand. The army wouldn't come to save them. They all looked at the screens, one of the girls pleading for mercy, asking if they knew how kind she was. Someone responded coldly, "Let her shut up and die," and the guy in the green jacket noted that they needed to kill someone. Kim turned around, still gripping the man by the jacket, angrily stating that they must choose someone to kill. The young man clenched his teeth, horror in his eyes, and the guy in the green jacket told him, "I already know what you're thinking. To kill someone in order to survive, only animals do that." The young man and the girl stood aside, watching what was unfolding. Kim added that he would be right, but questioned whether this applied to the current situation. The guy in the green jacket raised his hand, his red glowing eyes locked onto the group. "This is beyond your control," he said. "You will die if you don't kill. Who will blame you? Think carefully, this world is no longer the same, and the new world dictates new rules." Kim bent down, and began to beat the victim with brutal force, spraying blood in all directions. He was the fastest to adapt to the world of survival methods, the one who drove a wedge into the crack of the new world. The 2 young people glanced at each other, hearing the words of despair that no matter how long they looked, they would all want to die. Passengers ran toward the guy in the green jacket, who continued to beat the victim. One of them said, "Well, never mind." Kim had destroyed their vague concept of morality. Lon turned away, not wanting to see the gruesome scene. His fists clenched, his body trembling. Doc thought to himself that if the first death did not occur within the next 5 minutes, everyone here would die. Passengers looked at the victim with fury in their eyes, as the man on the floor shook with pain. Doc recalled a particular paragraph he had read in the novel, and KH leaned over, clenching his teeth, horror flashing in his eyes. The plot told them that they were like executioners pulling the lever at the same time. The boy with the box in his hands lowered his eyes and silently watched the scene unfold. Doc stood with a bag on his shoulder, peering ahead, telling himself that he was watching them as though he were reading that very paragraph. The guy and S were behind the red line, watching the crowd kill the victim. He thought, "It's as if I'm looking at this scene from another world. I'm just watching the performance." In the short story, the old woman, unknown to him, became the first victim. Doc wondered if it was right to watch her die, his grip tightening on his phone. He had no choice but to observe. Doc looked in surprise at the girl, who was about to go to the rescue. She said that if this continues, she would die. The young man grabbed her shoulder to stop her, saying that she couldn't act recklessly. S turned around and replied that she knew, but the guy added, "If you go there now, you'll be killed." Doc looked into the frightened girl's eyes and touched her chin, then said to her, "Stay here." Sun gritted her teeth and directed her gaze forward. The young man continued to hold her hand, thinking that although the genre of the story had changed, it still shone brightly. He approached her from behind, placing his hand on her shoulder, realizing that the person who could change this story was not Sun, because she was not the protagonist of this world. Doc sat his friend down, placing the bag on the floor, and asked her to stay put. She tried to object, but he asked her to listen just once. After that, he wouldn't disturb her. The guy opened his mouth and exhaled deeply. Doc turned away, placed the bag on the floor, and stretched his fingers. He looked forward, thinking that it was still too early for him to interfere. This was not his original plan, but he had no choice. Sun turned to him and called his name. He realized that he had done nothing because he was afraid of Kim, Naaman, or the others. Doc lowered his head and closed his eyes, thinking it wasn't because he agreed with their inhumane methods. He stood, watching the passengers beat the man, waiting for the right moment. Just then, Ez turned around and opened her mouth, gasping at what she saw in the next carriage. A fire was raging, and clouds of dust were rising. Doc narrowed his eyes, looking forward with confidence, realizing that it was time to act. He ran along the carriage, and behind him, Sin covered her face with her hands from the heat of the fire and the smoke filling the carriage. Information appeared on the main scenario, indicating proof of significance. You need to kill one or more life forms. Category: Main difficulty F. Time: 30 minutes. Reward: 300 coins. Failure: death. A message popped up that the remaining time was 7 minutes and 32 seconds.